God, look at all the trucks back in there. Whee! Look at this. I gotta clear all the gravel out of the creek, so they've built this road, they got all those trucks in there. It's a construction zone.
So see, they're getting paid like it's a full load every load.
George and Mary Zweck first purchased this land along the St. Vrain Creek around 1863. And for the past 150 years and 4 generations, it's been in the same family. Gail Zweck and her son John now live on the farm, and John takes care of most of the day-to-day operations here. I'm so appreciative to them for their generosity of letting me wander their farm area unimpeded. And John has been so instrumental in helping me capture so many of the great things of beauty that I have found here. I used to climb the fence right here. I think John put this gate in just for me. He's so nice. I've spent so much time out here, it's like my home. I've learned all the different little nooks and crannies of the farm and what goes on in different areas. It's been a great experience. It's been a great experience. I've learned so many birds. I've learned where to look for them and the different shapes and the different kinds. Finding that owl nest was a special thing, and that was very, very fun. With all the time I've spent here over the past 5 years, I've chronicled well over 80 species of birds, and I've been able to capture images of most of them. It's been wonderful. The kingfishers became my obsession. It took me 2.5 years to get a photograph of the kingfisher with a fish in her bill, but I finally got it after learning every place she went to perch and feed. Funny, I was doing the kingfishers, and after spending time with them, I realized I used to draw these as a kid. And it really brought back some great memories, and I've figured out that kingfisher's my totem. In the spring, this little pond is normally filled with water, and it's a great little wetlands area. And I set up one of my early hides here, and I immediately started seeing some really neat stuff. Red-winged blackbirds, you can hear them in the background, they're all over. And so they got so close sometimes I could barely focus on them. So that was fun to get some face shots of them. But I saw a bird called a sora, which is related to coots, and it was walking around in here. I'd never seen one of those. That was fun to see. And every time I'd see a new animal, or especially birds, I would run back to the truck when I was done and look it up, and that was always really fun. But one day on my birthday, the 1st of spring, a group of green-winged teals landed here. It's the only time I've seen them here, and it was the first time I'd ever seen them. It's a beautiful, beautiful bird. But probably the jewel here was wood ducks. And they're considered one of the most beautiful ducks in North America, and I would have to agree with that. And the first time an immature male came in and landed, and it had some familiar markings, but I just couldn't quite place it, and I knew it was an adolescent. And a few others flew in, and they hung around a bit and then went back in the reeds to feed. And the next day, you better believe I was back out here first thing in the morning, and a pair of mature wood ducks came in, and the male just blew me away. They are gorgeous. They've got blues and greens and tans and reds, and just a showy bird. And the female's quite beautiful too. And they swam around a bit. They looked like they were looking for something, and I think they were looking for their offspring. And they swam back into the reeds looking for them. Didn't find them, came back out, and they flew off. But I've had several encounters with them here, and watching their behavior and how the males vie for the females and everything was quite interesting. This has been a very productive wetlands area to photograph. The first spring I started coming out to the farm, I went on a trip, and when I came back about the 1st of April, John excitedly told me that we had a pair of osprey on his nest. I said, what? I didn't even know we had an osprey nest out here. I'd not even been out to this north end of the farm. And so early the next morning I ran out here and found a pair of ospreys sitting up on this nest pole. From the urging of a friend, John had erected this the fall before, and there were all kinds of plans he could have followed, but he said, you know, I can figure this out. So he put up this pole and the nest on top, and it's been used every year since. It's actually the most productive osprey nest in Boulder County. But the first morning I came out, I was able to witness the osprey mating, and I became enthralled with them. So of course I go to John and say, I've got to get up higher. I need to get up high so I can photograph into this nest. And he's like, well, I got an old scaffolding I've never put together before. Would that work? I'm like, yeah, let's do it. So he and I and a friend of his, we came out here and had this old beat up rusted scaffolding, and we put that thing up and moved it into position. And I thought, should I try to hide from these birds while I get up in there or not? And I thought, no, I'm just going to let them get used to me. They were so used to John, plowing and driving his tractor around here that it was fine. So in the morning I would come and climb the scaffolding and just sit there, and they got totally used to me, and after a while they never even looked at me. But I spent 5 years every summer with this osprey family, and I learned so much about them. The first year they had 2 offspring, the next 2 years they had 3 offspring, and the 4th year they had 4 offspring. And that doesn't sound too bad until you consider that the male has to feed the entire family for about 2 months. So once she lays the eggs, she's on that nest, and he will come and bring her food, and he will then sit on the nest, and she will take the food off and fly and stretch her wings out a little bit and eat, and then she'll come back and sit on the eggs again. Once they're hatched, she does not leave the nest for about 2 months. So the male's job is to keep the entire family fed. And when you consider that these offspring, once they're about ready to fledge, they can each eat about 6 pounds of fish a day. So you can imagine the amount of work the male has got to do to keep everybody fed. He'd bring a fish in, they'd be screaming for food, they would eat that very fast, and they're screaming at him again. So off he would go to fish more. Her job isn't any easier in that she's got to stay with the offspring, defend any predator, birds of prey that may come, and also to keep them shaded. When it gets brutally hot here, she'll sit with her wings out and shade the offspring, and they're all panting. So it's quite an effort that these 2 parents do to raise the young. And the cooperation is just incredible. Spending as much time as I did with them, I learned all of their calls. They have calls for greeting, they have calls when they're hungry, they have calls when they're concerned because there's another osprey in the area and they might be worried about it coming in and trying to displace them. But it's an amazing bird. They're slightly smaller than an eagle, but they're much more agile hunters. They pretty much just eat fish. They will occasionally take a snake, but when they catch fish, they will drop into the water and they almost submerge. And to see a video of them coming out of the water with a fish in their talons and being able to gain flight again is just incredible. We just watched the mating ritual just a few minutes ago, and it was great. The female's on the nest, and the male's over here sitting on a perch, enjoying this wonderful spring day. The first year I was here watching the Osprey family, I noticed that the male likes to use various perches to feed when he's trying to eat himself, and he was using our scaffolding a lot and created quite a mess on there. So after the first year, once the Osprey were gone, I told John, "You need an epic perch." And he looked at me and said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "You know, we need to put up a perch that's fitting for this osprey." So he gave it some thought and came up with a great idea. So he had another post that he used, and we put a natural looking limb on it and erected that nice and close to the nest. And by golly, the next spring, when the first osprey came back, he excitedly called me and said, "We got Osprey back." And I ran out, and when I got here, there was an osprey sitting on that perch eating a fish. And I knew that we were successful with gaining a perch for the osprey, and it's been used ever since. One of the things we did learn, though, is that these red-winged blackbirds that you can hear all around us are very territorial, and they do not like birds of prey, and they will chase them. And by the middle of the summer, when the red-winged blackbirds were having their offspring, they started harassing the osprey sitting on that post. And they'd bring in a fish, and the male would try to be eating there, and the red-winged blackbirds were just harassing it and hitting it and landing on it. And so it wasn't used for about a month during the summer, and that's true every year. But once the red-winged blackbird's offspring are gone, then they can use that perch again. The offspring of the osprey will also use it too. About September, once the osprey have fledged and are flying around and trying to learn how to feed themselves, the whole family is going to take off and migrate south. And the osprey in this region tend to migrate down to Mexico, and some of them go as far down into Central America. They leave together, but studies have shown that the mated pair do not spend the winter together, so they're alone. And the fascinating part of this is around late March, the osprey start returning, and we'll be on the lookout, and one day there'll be an osprey sitting on the nest here, and within a week, and sometimes it's a day later, the other one shows up. So they're down in their migratory areas, they get a stimulus to come up here, and they can arrive after all those thousands of miles within a week of each other. And it's phenomenal. It happens every year in all the different nests in Boulder County. You start hearing about that. But what timing, and what a miracle of nature. There are nests all over here. One year a robin built a nest on a hay bale inside John's hay shed. So of course I had to set up a spot very close to that, and it was really fun to see all the different food that she would bring in for the offspring. That included, of course, lots of worms, but I saw my first dragonfly of the season with her bringing one in to feed. Butterflies, caterpillars, all kinds of insects. Let's see, well, you want me to, we can look at that out the window and then I'll back up and go? You want to do that?
Sure. Now this is Zweck had her garden club out here one year, and she asked me to come and give a talk to all these ladies about the farm. And I really got carried away.
You can talk.
And after we were done, several of the ladies came and asked me if I would take them for a nature walk around the pond. I thought, well, I hit the jackpot on that
Good,
one.
yeah. There's a lot you can say about this place, that's for sure.
I'm not crazy about this over here, but we can't do anything about that.
Yeah, I saw that. That was a leaker, though. It was getting worse.
I'm going to fix all of that. That's what I'm getting ready to do. Right. I put in a new furnace a year ago, and when they did that, they went around with some stuff. This weird stuff. Coated all the
Several years I've been photographing here on the farm. I've been amazed at the wildlife and diversity that I've seen here. It's included snapping turtles laying eggs. Before work one day, John called me and said there's a snapping turtle digging a nest. So I ran out before work and got down on my hands and knees and was able to get very close to this snapping turtle digging a hole to lay its eggs. And once they do that, they're in a trance. So I was able to kind of creep up and get some nice close-up shots of her. And then later in the summer, I was able to go back to that spot and find the remnants of the eggs after all the little turtles hatched. I've seen mink, seen fox, coyote. There's been turkeys here. I've counted an obvious number of like 85 species of birds, and I'm sure I've missed some of the more obscure ones that hide more, but there's just been a tremendous amount of wildlife here. And then you also get into the small world with all the insects that are here, including katydids, all kinds of butterflies, and dragonflies, which have become one of my favorite insects. Dragonflies are incredibly beautiful, and we all see those and see those little fairies flying around water and in the fields. But they're also amazing predators. Having watched them through a close-up lens, whenever they're perched, they're always looking, and they will go out and come back, and they're always chewing. So they're very efficient hunters, and they can catch and eat most insects and spiders, and I've witnessed some of that. There's a pond hawk that has been known to eat other dragonflies and damselflies, and I actually watched one catch a damselfly and eat it, and it was almost like eating spaghetti as the abdomen of the damselfly just slowly disappeared into its mouth. But the life cycle of a dragonfly is fascinating. The eggs are laid in water, and a larva, a nymph, will emerge from that, and they will live in the water 3 to 5 years. And they're also voracious hunters, and will eat other larvae and other eggs and that kind of thing. And then some mysterious signal will occur, and very, very early in the morning, when it's still dark, they will climb up onto a reed, like all the reeds along the pond here, and they will hang there, and they will crack out of their nymph shell, and like a butterfly, they'll hang there, and their wings will unfurl, and once they're fully out and dried, then they can take off and fly. And I've been able to observe that and capture that in images. The other thing that's very interesting about dragonflies is if you've ever watched them at all, occasionally you'll see a pair joined, and they call it a circle. And when you look at that, and you know they're mating, but it just doesn't make sense when you look at the body parts that are connected. But I learned that what happens is The male first will prepare himself, and he will bring his abdomen up to his chest. He will deposit a sperm packet on his chest. And then he will go find a female, and on the end of his abdomen he has claspers that will clasp the female right behind her head. And this will join them so that they can fly like that. And then the female, if she's ready, will bring her abdomen up to his chest, and he has appendages that first clean off any other sperm packets that may be on that abdomen from another individual, and then he will deposit his sperm packet onto her abdomen. He will then stay locked with her, and certain species will stay like that, and she will dip in the water and lay her eggs. Other species, he will break off from her just before she lays eggs, but he will hover over her, protecting her from other males coming in to mate with her. And then he will join back up. But it's a fascinating thing to watch, and that's the full cycle then. As she's dropping the eggs in water, a nymph will then hatch from that. One morning I was out early wanting to capture the dragonfly coming out of the nymph casing. So I got in my shorts and sandals and climbed into the water. So I was about waist deep with my camera. And I was looking along the shore looking for these casings. And I saw joined dragonflies flying around the pond laying eggs. In this particular species, the male would disengage from the female as she would drop and lay her eggs. And I'm just watching this, and it almost stopped my heart, but a fish came up from underneath and grabbed that female, and she was gone. And I thought, well, that's probably one reason the male probably disengages from her. But it was startling to see her just disappear like that. So everything here has a predator. And even the dragonflies that seem very nimble, when she was laying her eggs, she was a little bit vulnerable, and the fish are watching from beneath, and she's going to become part of the food cycle. This is just about where I set up my kingfisher hide, right in here. It looks very different now after the flood, with all the trees flattened and kind of cleared out. But this was a great spot. And from this hide, besides seeing the kingfishers doing all their things, I saw lots of fun stuff. Mating muskrat, a robin building a nest, and a mink one time. It was the first time I'd seen a mink. And it was lying on a log right across the creek and playing and rolling around. As soon as it heard my shutter go off, it heard that and looked at me and looked right into my lens a couple times. I got some nice shots, and then off he went. Since then, I've seen quite a few here, and John's even had a couple run up to him with a fish in their mouth until they realized that he was there. But it was a really, really fun, productive spot. And in the spring, the birds in here were just raucous. They were so loud. We also had a beaver episode where a couple beavers came in here and just started felling all these trees, and they were also trying to block up the creek. But spring runoff kind of takes care of that, and eventually they were trapped and moved. But they were pretty much laying down all the trees around here. And it's amazing how they can alter the environment. It kind of takes you back to your childhood when you used to build forts. And I would crawl into these things first thing in the morning when it was still kind of dark. And you watch the world wake up and watch all kinds of things happening around you that you would never appreciate otherwise. So you get a real intimate view of an area when you sit hidden for quite a while. The first spring I was here, I was standing a bit over there working on something, and I would see kingfishers fly up and down the creek here, and I found them to be really beautiful animals and really fun to see, but they're very skittish, and I figured I'll never actually be able to get many photographs of them. And when I was working on that blind over there, the kingfisher came down the river and landed in an area that, where I was kind of hidden, and I was watching her, and she dove into the water, came up with a crawfish in her bill, and proceeded to eat it right on this perch. And I was enamored by that, so I started looking around, and right across the creek from there, right over here, was a great spot where I could set up a hide. So sure enough, I set up another one and started spending hours and hours there. Well, I never again saw a kingfisher eat from that perch, but they did use the perch and perches in that area, so I was able to photograph them. Kingfishers kind of became my obsession. They're about the size of a robin with a very large head, a very large bill, and then a punk crest on the top of their heads, which really sets them off. They dive into the water and catch crawfish and fish, and then they will beat them on the perch they're on to stun them, and then down the hatch they'll go. As I spent time watching them, it came to me that as a child I used to draw kingfishers, and I'm not sure what attracted me to them at that point, but they have a very special place in my heart. Another thing that's neat about kingfishers is the female is prettier than the male, and it's more colorful. Generally, in almost the entire bird world, the male is more colorful, but not with kingfishers. So I spent many hours in the morning sitting in the hide waiting for kingfishers to come by. One day I saw a pair right up over the bank, and they were mating, and I just couldn't believe it. And after they would mate, they would fly off and come back, and I had done research and learned that kingfishers dig tunnels in dirt piles for their nest. And I thought, I wonder if that's what they're doing. So later that day, John and I went around to the other side and watched for a while, and sure enough, they were digging a hole in the side of dirt. And I found out that they can dig a tunnel up to 8 feet deep, and then they'll have a chamber at the end, and that's where they will lay the eggs. The female will stay in that hole for about 2 weeks, keeping the eggs at the right temperature, and the male will bring food to her. Once the eggs are hatched, she's done. She is out and on her own, and then the male's job is to feed the young. That's another difference in this bird. So we immediately moved another blind up near the nest hole, and John, over a week's time, moved it in closer and closer so it was in a good spot. And I was able to film the male coming in to feed the young. Eventually you could see the mouths of the young coming out of the hole to be fed, and I was there for one of the first young that came out. I spent time photographing the young for a week or two, and then eventually everybody dispersed and they were gone, and it was kind of sad to see them all go. Kingfishers are fairly solitary, and the female had this territory, so she continued to be here. But I never had that perfect shot of her. So I kept watching and learning where she would perch, and eventually one late winter day I got her. She landed in just the right spot for me. The light was good, the background was good, and I was so happy, and that took me 2 years to get that shot. A couple months later I was able to catch her with a fish in her bill, and got those shots, and those were the piece de resistance. After that she disappeared, and we don't really know what happened to her. We had 2 males together. I figured they were brothers hanging out here, and now we have a new female, so that's great. But if you spend some time on waterways, you should eventually be able to see and or hear one. They have a very loud rattle, and once you hear that, you'll never forget it. And they're a fun bird to locate and watch, and if you're lucky, you can see them fishing. I spent so much time out here and gotten so used to how it looks. This used to be a green, nice waterway, and it's amazing the flood brought in all this gravel and just covered it. And it's not as pretty as it used to be. It'll come back, but it's going to take a long time. And it's a trickle now, but not going to be more than a week or two. This is going to be roaring. All the snow we've had this winter. But the birds are back. God, it's a beautiful day. On a beautiful morning with all kinds of construction going on. Can you hear the background traffic? You can, okay. That's encroachment. Guess that's what that is. I've been living in Longmont over 30 years, and as I've driven down Airport Road, I always cross the St. Vrain Creek, and I always look west towards this, and I wonder, what's back in there? I see this beautiful old farm, and the pastures, and the cows, and the trees along the St. Vrain Creek, and Long's Peak dominating everything. And what is here? What kind of wildlife is there, and what is still around? I first came to the farm when it was featured on a garden tour set up by Longmont Symphony as a fundraiser. And I immediately took a liking to Gail, and we had a great conversation. And I mentioned to her that I might want to do some photography on her farm, and she said she thought that would be okay. And then I said, well, I might even want to set up some blinds or some hides to capture some of the more skittish creatures. And she again said, well, that'd probably be fine, but I don't know how the cows are going to handle that. I didn't think that would be much of an issue, but little did I know how prophetic that would be. There are three main buildings here, as well as the barn. The original farmhouse was built in 1865 or so, and Gail Zweck still lives in there, and John lives in a small house next door, and the other building also housed some of the family members over time. Cows have seen me for years and years, and they still stare at me like they've never seen me before. What are you doing? So I'll come to you. I'll drool on you. I'll drool on you. I'm good with that. I'm good with that. I'll drool on you. I've watched John over the years, and he's a farmer and a rancher, but he's a plumber, he's an engineer, he's a veterinarian, got to be a meteorologist, welder, mechanic. You got to be able to do everything. Spring comes early to the farm here. By February, the barley has to be planted, and the calves start being born at that time. They need to be mature enough for the next winter, so the earlier they can be getting started maturing, the better. Once they get a little bit older, they start getting real spunky, and especially at dusk. They're running around literally kicking up their heels and headbutting and having a great time. Cows on this farm have a very good life. A couple weeks ago I saw some of the moms doing the same thing. They were running around and headbutting and kicking up their heels, having a great time. I remember a few years ago I was out here and I started walking away from the cows here, and I turned around and there was about 6 of the cows following me. Every time I'd stop and turn around at them, they would stop and just stare. And then I would turn around, start to walk, and they would all follow me again, and I would turn around and they would stop. I felt like a Pied Piper. What a wonderful setting they have here. This tree has been around obviously for a long, long time, and looking at the inside of it, you can see how rotted it is. And when the big piece split off, it exposed all of this interior area, and I imagine the woodpeckers had a ball going after all the insects that were in all that rot. And I'm sure it was good feeding for quite a while. I affectionately refer to this as the tree. This is where the owls nested. It used to look a little better before it split a couple of years ago, and a big piece of this came down. When I first came out here, having rarely seen an owl, I started hearing some hoot-hooting one dusk. And after looking around quite a bit, I was able to make out the shape of a great horned owl in one of these trees. So I knew that they liked this area. And later that spring, John informed me that the owl was sitting up in this tree in a nest. And I came over to look at it, and the camouflage was phenomenal. And you had to know what you were looking for to see her in the crotch of this tree. And I went away on a trip, and when I came back, John informed me that she had abandoned the nest because some work had to be done on the head gate here. And we were all pretty bummed out about that. But as luck would have it, the next spring, she came back and nested here again. So John and I built an elevated hide. We affectionately called it the castle, and moved that into position so I was able to photograph the offspring. Over the next 5 weeks, I had a great time watching these cute little fluff balls grow into almost sinister looking birds. There's a red-tailed hawk. Great horned owls are one of our biggest owl species in the United States. They're incredible hunters, as are all the owls. And they prefer rabbits and mice. And they're one of the very few animals that will actually catch and eat skunks. They don't have any sense of smell, so that really helps with that. But watching these owlets grow up was really fun, and towards the end, before they fledged, they'd be climbing around in the nest, and they actually started climbing up the trunk of the tree a little bit just to get their feet a little stronger. The grip that they have with their talons is one of the strongest grips of any animals. And only once did I see Mom bring in some prey, and it was just a piece of a blue jay. But most of the hunting is done at night, So I was basically spending a lot of time watching the owlets sleep and then get up and move around when Mom would come back. It gets kind of hard when you spend a lot of time with a family of animals like that. Eventually they're going to fledge. And after about 5 or 6 weeks, they climbed up into the tree. I saw them a couple times then, and then after that they were gone. Fortunately and unfortunately, they didn't nest in this tree again. The following year, about halfway through the nesting season, a big piece of bark fell down off the tree right into where they had their nest. I have some friends that thought that she might have even known that that was going to happen. They're still around, but they haven't nested in this tree since. And then a couple of years ago, about half of it split off. And it's not the tree that it was. I certainly have learned here that although season to season you see things consistently, many specifics change all the time. And you may think you see something one time and you can come back and see it again, and that is not true. I've learned that many times. Appreciate what you see because it may not happen again. I did a lot of research on great horned owls, and they're fascinating animals. They can ventriloquialize, so they can throw their hoots, which will kind of mask exactly where they are. All owls are built, their feathers are built such that when they fly, they're absolutely silent, and obviously they will need that as they're coming down on prey at night. Another fascinating thing about owls is they have great eyesight, but their hearing is phenomenal. And their ears are not placed symmetrically in their skull, so that they're oriented slightly different from each other. And when they hear something, they can turn their head and actually have stereophonic hearing, and they can hone in on a specific area where the prey is. And then they can go in there and hit that. So even when it's real dark, their hearing is so good and so precise that they can locate prey. The great gray owls can actually hear mice through the snow, and they can pound through the snow to catch a mouse. It's a fascinating animal. Owls are incredible predators, and just looking at them, they're just intense looking birds of prey. Kestrels are another really cool bird I found out on the farm. They're also called sparrowhawks because they like to prey on small birds, but they also eat a lot of mice and even insects. In my opinion, they're beautiful birds of prey, and they might be small in stature, but they're very mighty in their spirit. They're quite tough. Even John describes them as pound for pound being one of the toughest animals on the farm. Many farms keep kestrel boxes to help keep the mice population down, and the Zweck farm is no exception. They've got one box that's been used for many years, and I thought this would be a good spot to get some photographs, so I built a very small light hide that I could move depending on morning or afternoon light, and it seemed to work pretty well. We decided to put up another perch near the box like we did with the Osprey, thinking that the parents would bring the food to the perch and then into the box to feed the offspring, and that did work well. I spent many hours at first without much happening, but then as the chicks got a little older, more food had to be brought in for them. The first time was the male flying in with a chick it stole out of a nest, and it culminated with the female bringing in a headless robin one time. It was obvious she was exhausted through probably the hunting, killing, and carrying of this thing back, and it was surprising. It was almost as big as she was. She flew it into the box, but immediately pulled it back out, probably realizing that there was too much to it to have in that box. She started trying to get the wings off and you know, that would make the whole bulk of the bird being a little smaller inside the box. It was kind of fun to watch. As the chicks got older, you'd start to see them sticking their heads out of the box. And eventually, one morning I was there when they fledged and came out and started learning to fly. The parents were around watching them, and after they had practiced a little bit, they started calling, and the offspring flew off with them, and that's the last I saw of them around the box. They do like to sit on the telephone lines a lot, so they're pretty easy to see if you spend any time out there. But again, I think they're one of the prettiest birds with multiple colors, and they're fun to watch. I encourage people to go out and find a piece of wildness and get to know it, and go back time and time again in all the seasons and learn the details of it. And it's very rewarding. And I think it helps people to realize that we're all connected. I sure have learned a lot here, and I think there's a lot to be gained by getting close to nature and the wild world and learning from it. There's many great stories with the Zweck family, having been around in this area for so long. One of my favorites is about Aunt Jean. She was one of the original daughters of George and Mary, and she never married and was very colorful. And at one point in her life, she homesteaded some land up in the mountains west of Loveland. And back then, you had to live on the land for a certain number of years, and then you could claim it. And so this woman stayed in a cabin up on this land for, I think it was 3 years. And there were times she was buried in that cat cabin in the winter. But because of that, she was able to gain that land. And later, when a piece of property became available on the creek on the other side, she traded her land for that. And that just made this whole farm area a little more complete. And she then lived on the farm for the rest of her life. And in 1976, when Longmont was celebrating their centennial, she was the Grand Marshal of the Centennial Parade in Longmont. And she was all dressed up in red, white, and blue. And after the parade was over, she came back and she saw Gail and said, "You know, this was one of the best days of my life." And she went back into her house and laid down on the couch and passed away. Could we all be so lucky to have the best day of our life and then close our eyes? First winter I started visiting the farm, I noticed animal tracks all over in the snow, especially lots of coyote tracks. And there's a big thicket over by the creek. And I noticed 2 doorways or portals where the tracks would come in and out. And I figured that's a route for the coyotes. So one early morning on a crisp, clear day, I went out and set up a chair right by a tree and just set up my camera and waited. It was a very cold morning. Thank goodness I like cold. And when the sun came up, the whole scene just turned pink. And just then a big, beautiful, bushy coyote came out of the portal and started walking right towards me. and I'm happily clicking away. And he finally looked up and saw me, and I looked a little different than the normal surroundings, and didn't run away, but just sort of skirted around me and kept on his merry way. And at that point I thought, that thing with the blinds or the hides I've got to do. So I started figuring out how to build some hides. And this is basic construction, just a square wooden frame with cloth around it. And that seemed to work quite well until I set up a blind where the cows had access. And that's when Gail Zweck's musings of how the cows would handle the blind came into existence. And I found that the first time I went back to one of these cloth blinds, it was ripped to shreds and all the cloth was all over the place. And I immediately thought of vandals, and then I thought, no, that wouldn't be it. I mentioned it to John, and he smiled and said, those calves are pretty ornery, aren't they? And sure enough, you start watching, and the calves just are very curious of everything. And when you put up something new in their environment, they're going to go check it out. And the cows would rub on it, but the calves stick their head in it and just go crazy with it and rip it apart. So after that happened about 2 or 3 times, John, in his quiet way, smiled and said, Peter, maybe you should put hard sides on them. I was like, really? So now we have plywood on there, and it makes them heavier, but it makes them a bit more cow-proof. Gosh, and all the time I've been spending out here at the farm, I sure have learned a lot. First, change. Despite the apparent consistency of seasons, every year it is different. Trees blow over, water run off from the amount of snow, the amount of rain, and the temperature variations all cause changes year to year. And then major events can permanently change the environment, like the flood. It will never be as it was, and it will recover, but it will become something very different. In some areas, it may never fully recover because of the ongoing pressures surrounding it. And then there's diversity. Even in this small area surrounded by development, some diversity remains. It is the lifeblood of the health of any ecosystem. As one species is removed, it affects species that are dependent on it for a food source, and the lost species are not feeding on their prey, causing a rise in the population of their numbers. The whole balance is then lost. Diversity is the fabric that holds the natural world together, and we are dependent on it, but sometimes we seem so removed from the natural world that we lose sight of this dependency. When one part of this chain is disrupted, it ripples through the whole chain. Our job is to keep the chain intact and connected. And then there's encroachment. This farm was originally away from all development, and even when Longmont was first established, it was well away from town. Over the past 150 years, development has slowly crept towards it. The railroad took its piece, Airport Road, and then widening of the road took more. Housing, municipal buildings, and an airport put more pressure on the land and all of its inhabitants. Even in the relatively short time I've been here, I have seen this inexorable pressure of surrounding encroachment, causing a steady degradation. Some wildlife has been eradicated subtly without us being fully aware of it, and others we actively destroy because we feel we cannot live with them or just for the pleasure of killing them. Surrounding neighbors actively kill coyote and fox without any real apparent reason. The numbers and variety of animals has decreased, affecting the balance. I so appreciate the willingness and the hospitality of the residents of this area, especially the Zwecks, of letting me wander the area and photograph it and learn it. This is a private area, and it's not really open to the public, but I would encourage everyone to find their own spot and become intimate with it and learn it. You can explore the wonder of nature in any area if you spend some time with it. I think it'll change your life, and it'll definitely change it for the better. To share this project with the outside world, my goal has been to produce a book highlighting the natural world around this farm along the St. Vrain with intriguing images and hopefully thoughtful prose. I've learned that this book making is another journey unto itself, and I'm actively working on it, so look forward to it.